how Dara Shikoh's 1650s Persian translation of the Upanishads ends up being translated into Urdu in 1867 by the important Punjab-based Arya Samaji Kanhaiya Lal Al-Akhdari, who was very concerned that Hindus, unlike Muslims and Christians, were unfamiliar with their own sacred texts. Try wrapping your head around the many ironies that are embedded in that example. And so on that note, it gives me the greatest pleasure to welcome Professor Gandhi to our Zoom podium. If you, the audience, have any questions, please use the Q&A function. I will try and get to as many as possible once Professor Gandhi has completed her talk about the concept of race in Mughal India. And so we are good to go at this moment. Professor Gandhi, the podium is all yours.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Professor Farooqi. And I would also like to thank Punita Kala for the superb arrangements for this webinar. I look forward to engaging with you today on a topic that is actually not related to the books and other writings that Professor Farooqi mentioned. This is a very new project, so I ask for your indulgence as I give you this little window into the beginnings of a project in progress. So let me just share my screen with you. Okay, hope that works. So the topic of my presentation today is the concept or concepts of race in Mughal India. And it's one that I am framing as a question rather than anything definitive. When recently invited to contribute an article on the broad theme of race in India, one of the things to which my mind turned was an essay authored by Francois Bernier, the French philosopher, physician, and traveler who lived for a decade in the Mughal Empire. I thought of this essay because Bernier, unlike the intellectuals of the Mughal Empire, offers a very explicit theory of race. He describes, I quote, 4 or 5 species or races of men so notably differing from each other that this may serve as the just foundation of a new division of the world, end quote. Bernier's essay elevates the first race, in his terms, as a normative benchmark against which the others are measured. Its members comprise the inhabitants of most of Europe, parts of North Africa, and much of West, South, and Southeast Asia, including, in his words, the realms of the Great Mughal and the Deccan kingdoms. Bernier justifies his inclusion of Indians and Egyptians here, despite their darker skin. He attributes their complexions to sun exposure rather than to an inherent quality. By contrast, blackness for Bernier is, in his words, an essential trait possessed by his second race, the inhabitants of Africa. It never vanishes, even if they settle elsewhere. The inhabitants of Central and East Asia constitute Bernier's third race. Finally, Bernier reserves a few derisive words for his fourth race, in his words, the terrifying-looking Lapps. Many scholars today argue that Bernier's essay represents a distinctive turn in the theorizing of race in early modern Europe. Bernier abandons the biblical monogenetic theory of the origins of different peoples from the sons of Noah. He also partially dispenses with Ptolemaic climatic determinism, which held that the climes in which people lived shaped their physical traits, though he still indirectly invokes its ideas. Bernier, like his contemporary Leibniz, follows a new use of the term race. Race, which used to denote lineage, now classifies social groups on the basis of their physiognomies. Most significantly, according to Justin Smith, for Bernier, quote, physical traits of human populations are now the very criterion by which regions are to be mapped out, end quote. Bernier's ideas about race are evidently deeply rooted in the intellectual milieu of late 17th century France. Meanwhile, Portuguese visitors to India increasingly deployed the term casta, the forerunner of the term caste. Such terms that once signified lineage and pedigree now offered totalizing explanations for human diversity and ways of ordering and classifying social collectives in India and elsewhere. I wondered to what extent Bernier's notion of race might have been intelligible to his Mughal interlocutors. I'm using Mughal as shorthand for denoting the diverse elites who used Persian as their primary literary language during the heyday of Mughal rule in the long 17th century. I do not have to conjure up an imagined interlocutor for Bernier because his patron and discussion partner in India was an Iranian emigrant Mansabdar with the title Danishmand Khan. The Khan's favorite pursuits were, Bernier reports, astronomy, geography, and anatomy, topics that very much had a bearing on the subject of race at the time. There was no word in Persian that corresponded to race. Yet the Persian literate elites of the subcontinent drew on and contributed to an established discourse of engaging human diversity, as well as enumerating and cataloging social groups. One of the operative frameworks for this was the akhlaq tradition, which paired a universal anthropology of the human being alongside a hierarchical cosmology, in which people are naturally graded in a hierarchical order. Since I have very few images here, this is actually a painting of master craftsmen from a folio of the Akhlaq-e-Nasiri that actually depicts this kind of hierarchy imagined in the Akhlaq tradition. Now, the question of race in Mughal India is a fraught one. There are serious implications in today's political climate to talking about race with respect to Mughal India. Votaries of Hindu nationalism regularly invoke the false claim that the Hindu population was as a whole enslaved under Mughal rule. They also portray Indian Muslims in racialized terms as foreign interlopers. Conversely, in academia, the very question of whether pre-modern or non-European societies had race is ripe for controversy, although a growing body of scholarship treats related topics such as medieval and early modern race in Europe, slavery in India, and race in classical Arabic literature. The race as such was not a distinct interpretive category in Mughal times. I'd like to raise the question of using the term as a lens in place of, say, colorism or xenology or xenophobia, which are also not emic terms from Mughal India. Scholars working on pre-modern race in other contexts offer insights in this regard. For instance, Geraldine Heng, who argues for an understanding of race as a quote, structural relationship that organizes human difference, or Anya Lumba and Jonathan Burton, who show how race works through, quote, tropes of difference, end quote, in early modern England. Such scholarship reveals that ideas of race are not only based on beliefs about biological difference. For instance, even the attribution of ideas or qualities to groups bound by religious affiliation or belief can be understood as participating in a discourse of race. I must clarify, of course, that race, if we are to call it that, in Mughal India, operated very differently from race in the 19th and 20th centuries. Here's an example by way of contrast. In 1873, 2 centuries after Bernier's essay, the reformist Mehdi Ali Khan gave a lecture bemoaning the status of Indian Muslims. When the Muslims arrived in India, they were very robust, rosy complexioned, surkh-o-safed, strong and healthy. Their natures were free as well. But when they made India their homeland and joined with those nations that were inferior to them in strength, courage, freedom, knowledge, and livelihood, nations in whose veins flowed restrictions, slavery to custom, and narrow-mindedness, then they too became so. Khan invokes ideas that were very different from those in Mughal times. His image of a pure race becoming degenerate through mixing with inferior races directly channels colonial conceptions of race and nation. One point of exploring how race or ideas that might somewhat correspond to race operated in pre-colonial India is to better understand the destabilizing transformations of colonialism. In what follows, I examine 3 strands from Mughal discourses of race, through texts dating from the late 16th through the 17th centuries. Here are the ways in which Persian texts explain human difference or theorize social stratification share both affinities with and divergences from the European discourses familiar to Bernier and his contemporaries. First, I briefly look at the biblical story of the curse of Noah's son Ham as it circulated in Persian texts of the era. Next, I explore the ways in which Persian writings across many genres embrace the theory of climatic determinism from Greek science. Finally, I compare Bernier's racialized depiction of Gentiles or Hindus with some Mughal depictions of Indian religions. The curse of Ham. The biblical story of the monogenetic origin of humans from Noah seemed to hold little explanatory power for Bernier, but it has been viewed as foundational to the construction of race and the linkage of race to slavery in the European context. It circulated widely in Arabic and Persian texts and was well known in the early modern period. One instance occurs in the massive encyclopedia of knowledge titled Shahid-e-Sadek, produced under Shah Jahan. It provides a conventional account narrating how Noah's son Ham was cursed with blackness, very similar to that offered by earlier Arabic sources. So Muhammad Sadek relates, some think Ham, son of Nuh, to be a divinely sent messenger. The residents of India and Ethiopia are his descendants. And then Sadek goes on to describe two different incidents where Ham is viewing something very inappropriate with regard to Noah. And then, so this results in his curse. When Noah awakes and becomes aware of the situation, he prayed for blessings for Sam and Japheth and said about Ham that God the Most High would make his children the slaves and servants of the children of Sam and Japheth. Then whatever he said happened. His children came into being black-colored. And then they then are the progenitors of the peoples of places such as Maghreb, Hind, Sindh, Nuba, Zanj, and so on. Now, even in works where biblical origins are not the organizing principle for human diversity, the curse of Ham still has a pervading presence. For instance, Amin Razi's late 16th century Hafte Iqlim, which is a geographical and biographical encyclopedia whose entries are divided according to the world's 7 climes. Here, the story of Ham appears in the context of Nubia. Razi first describes the geographical attributes of the region, its location by the Nile River, its breadth, crops, and religion of its people. Then he relates the Ham anecdote, mentioning that the people of Nubia were descended from Ham's sons. He relates that Ham was considered a prophet, but after the incident with his father, the line of prophethood was severed with his generation. Rather than using the Ham story to provide an explanation for the origin of all peoples from Noah, Razi deploys it to offer an explanation for the existence of blackness. But other writings also diminish the importance of the Ham story. Second, please. And even subvert it somewhat. For instance, the Ain-e-Akbari of Abul Fazl relates the anecdote, but it omits Ham's error and subsequent curse. The story still explains the division of the earth, but it is stripped of its normative charge. So he merely mentions that Ham was the son of Nuh and so on. And in another place, he quotes the legend regarding the division of the earth, but without the sting of the curse. Persianate writers extended the genealogy of Noah's descendants to identify the progenitors of the subcontinent's various regions. For instance, the Tarikh-e-Firishta retells the Ham story, but eliminates any mention of shame or slavery. Moreover, it folds the story into a distinctively Indic lineage of rulers. Muhammad Qasim Astarabadi, its author, gives a detailed exposition of Ham's descendants. He lists the 4 sons of Ham's son Hind, who were Purab, Bang, Dakhin, and Naharwal, who gave rise to the peoples of the subcontinent's four quarters. And then he further lists their descendants, which include the legendary Krishna. Sadiq Isfahani, author of the Shahid-e-Sadiq, also incorporates Firishta's genealogy. His work includes a detailed index of place names together with brief descriptions. Here, for instance, his entry on Bengal mentions that the place is named after Bang, son of Ham. The entry on Neherwala, a city in Gujarat, states that it was also named after Neherwal, the son of Ham. And one finds this genealogy repeated through to the 19th century as received knowledge. I'm going to move on to climatic theory. While the curse of Ham is an origin story of descent, it sits alongside the theory of climes, which offers a very different explanation for human diversity. Galenic and Ptolemaic theories of climatic determinism permeated early modern Persian writings through the earlier reception of the Greek tradition in Arabic. Persian writers, geographers, but writers in other genres as well, envisioned the world as being divided into 7 climes or latitudinal zones running from south to north. The positions of these climes were thought to influence the bodies and physical characteristics of their inhabitants. Abul Fazl lays out several theories elucidating their details. Common to all is the idea that those living closer to the equator and therefore in more direct contact with the sun have darker skin. Though there was another theory also from Ptolemy that maps each clime with the influence of a particular planet that was also believed to have a bearing on the skin tone of the people there. So this is just a list of the 7 climes with the skin colors as mentioned by Abul Fazl, who's using language steeped in empiricism. He gives the exact latitudinal coordinates, etc., for each clime, and then describes these colors: black in between black and wheat hued in between wheat and white, and so on, going from light to dark. While most of these descriptions adopt a neutral tone, Abul Fazl also slips in statements reflecting what we would know today to be anti-Black racism, such as this: those who live near the equator are called Zanjis. They are absolutely black, sakhsio, and their forms do not resemble human beings, Mardom, end quote. Other Mughal writers also echo such derogatory attitudes towards the inhabitants of the African continent. Aminuddin Khan Haravi, author of the geography Malumat al-Afaq, describes the Habshis, whom he also calls Zanjis, as untrustworthy. He further remarks on their physical characteristics, mentioning large lips and dark skin, which he attributes to excessive heat. Haravi also declares, quote, their land is devoid of grace, barakat, and they are bereft of accepting religion, deen, end quote. I'm going to pause a moment to further contextualize such remarks on the people of Zanj and Blackness in general. And I'm going to do so by introducing some concepts from the science of physiognomy, explaining how a person's physical characteristics reflect his inner character, and how this having been absorbed into the Islamic sciences via an Arabic translation of a Greek treatise by Polemon. It's also conceptually linked to climatic humoralism. My source for views on physiognomy circulating at the Mughal court is a brief anonymous manuscript that had been in the possession of Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and Alamgir, which is indicated from the inscriptions and seals, suggesting that it had long remained a prized possession in the imperial library. This work was calligraphed by Mir Ali in 1537 in Bukhara. It's anonymous. The Risala gives a list of skin colors and their attributes. Fiery red color is a sign of excessive blood, haste and madness. Yellow color, a sign of inner filth. Red and white color is a sign of balance and praiseworthy disposition or morals. Pure red color is a sign of life. A dark, sabs, now I'm not wedded to any particular sort of translation of sabs here, but a dark leaning to black color or yellow leaning to black color is a sign of bad disposition, khulq. An olive, asmar complexion is a sign of sagacity. This brief classification reveals a distinct hierarchy of skin shades derived from Greek thought. Some darker colors have a positive connotation, as for instance, the color asmar, while fiery red is viewed negatively. Nevertheless, a mixture of black or siyah is seen to indicate bad character. The Arabic translation of Polemon's influential treatise depicts the Greeks as possessing the ideal white and red balance in their complexion. The Risala also refracts this idea, which is here stripped of its identification with the Greeks. Recall, though, that Abul Fazl, probably in a nod to his Indian environment, identifies the people of the intermediate and most desirable climes with the colors white and wheat-hued instead of white and red. Now, in this section of the Risala, there's no mention of the absolute blackness, the sakht siyah that Abul Fazl mentions. But Polemon does deride those with black skin as cowards who lack ambition and identifies them as the Ethiopians, Zanj, Egyptians, and those of surrounding areas. Nonetheless, the Risala in other places also links its description of physical traits to specific peoples like those of China and the Zanj. Back to the climes, and I'm going to sort of just make the broad point that the climes were not only physical divisions of the earth, they were also cultural zones. Their boundaries were not set in stone. India's place within the climes shifted with its growing centrality to the world of Persian letters. So while the Ain-e-Akbari mentions that India is in the first, second, third, and fourth climes, Biruni's earlier work on India, which is one of its sources, earlier locates the subcontinent only in the first climb. According to climatic theory, geography influenced one's bodily characteristics as well as one's temperament, then it stands to reason that favorable geography would produce a positive impact on the inhabitants of a place. Although Babur famously decried India's heat and dust, several later Mughal writers emphasized India's superior climate. Abul Fazl begins the Ain-e-Akbari by situating and extolling Hindustan, which for him is not limited to the political boundaries of Akbar's empire. He then pronounces that Hindustan was unequaled, quote, unequaled in its climate, its rapid succession of harvests, and the equal temperament of its people, end quote. Despite such praise of India's climate, certain parts of the subcontinent were portrayed as being more salubrious and conducive to better temperaments, while the climate of others was depicted as having a negative impact on its people. Bengal was one such area. Abul Fazl described it as a land where owing to the climates favoring the base, the dust of dissension is always rising, end quote. Now, Abul Fazl made this evaluation in the context of the recent Mughal conquest of Bengal from the Afghans who had ruled it. There are other Mughal accounts too of the enervating climate of Bengal affecting the ability of its people. In contrast, the Shahid-e-Sadiq, whose author lived in Bengal, extols the monsoon, which he refers to as the Barskal of Bengal, in a section dedicated to indexing various geographical territories. He compares the land's lushness to a greened parrot. Quote, it turns the color of a parrot from the blessing of the climate, literally Aba Hava, water and air, end quote. He also adds, everyone who is old becomes young through this air. And compares the shimmering water to the mythical Arjang, or the painting book of the legendary Mani. Muhammad Sadiq's verses celebrating Bengal's climate form only one small example among the countless instances in Indo-Persian literature praising the geography of Hindustan or of specific regions. And I've written about this in various, a couple of places, and Sunil Sharma has also written a lot about the celebration of place and sort of topography in Indo-Persian poetry. When viewed against the prevailing concepts of the relationship between climes and their inhabitants, these idealized descriptions of nature, topography, and climate might also be seen as reflections on the people living in those regions. I'm going to move to the final portion of my talk, which is on racialized religion. Accounts of religious austerity offer another site on which to explore discourses of race. Bernier's travelogue depicts religious difference in racial terms that do not fully correspond to the essay he would later write. For instance, after discussing the lineage of the Mughal dynasty in India, he describes the Mughals as a race. He adds, to be considered a Mughal, it is enough if a foreigner have a white face, and he uses the term blanc over here, and profess Mohammedanism in contradistinction to the Christians of Europe, who are called Farangis, and the Hindus whose complexion is brown and who are Gentiles, end quote. Here, Bernier uses whiteness to draw a parallel between Europeans and Mughals, who, however, are distinguished by religious difference. He characterizes the Hindus, or natives of India, by both their brown skin and gentile religion. Thus, although Bernier later classifies Mughals, Indians, and Europeans as all members of his first race, here he uses the term race to identify a more specific social group. He also articulates an idea of whiteness as a distinct category. Though Bernier's concept of whiteness and its relationship with race may seem inchoate and inconsistent, the work of scholars like Geraldine Heng indicates that there had already been a sustained development of the idea of whiteness as in her words, a defining characteristic of the European subject. The Mughal elites sometimes identified with whiteness or with partial whiteness. This identification, as well as the concept of whiteness itself, took on a different form. There was a distinction assumed between white skin and the extreme paleness that writers in Arabic and Persian viewed as an aberration found in the northern climatic extremities. Whiteness was not necessarily seen as a common denominator of Northern Europeans and those Muslims in Hindustan who were of foreign birth or descent. For instance, the early 18th century writer Harawi mentions in his natural history entitled Malumat al-Afaq that the color of the inhabitants of the fifth clime was white, Safid. This includes the lands of Turkestan, Transoxania, North Khorasan, all the way down to Kerman, then up to Fars and Rey, back up to northern Iraq, Azerbaijan, and part of Armenia, then through Rome, Greece, and the regions bordering the Mediterranean. By contrast, he includes in the first clime, associated with blackness or Aswad alone, parts of Hind and Sindh, Nubia, Berber, and various other lands, including Britannia or England. In this context, it is pertinent to mention that in the sphere of Persian literature, so this is just another site on which these colors play out. The old trope contrasting the Turk and Hindu endured through the early modern period. Now, it's impossible to do justice to the whole history of this in just a couple of examples, but I am going to include them just to give you a taste of the complexity of this literary motif. Here, the Hindu, a literary motif connoting both Indian and of the Hindu religion, is identified with blackness, while the Turk is identified with whiteness or light. Now, in these poetic uses, blackness or darkness does not always have to be a negative quality, although sometimes it is. The Turk also is seen as the bearer of various negative qualities, such as cruelty and so on. Now, here is one example of how this motif was invoked in two couplets from a ghazal by Sohaib Tabrizi, the renowned 17th century poet who served both Mughal and Safavid patrons. Sohaib articulates in this ghazal a vision of divine union over the world's multiplicity. Now, I see that time is short, so I'm not going to read the Persian text, but just to give you a sense of it. So, to my eyes, the world's night and day appear of one color. The enmity of Turk and Hindu, I do not know, I do not know. The spring garden of unity, Wahdat, has no two-colored charming rose. Here, the Gule Ra'na actually is not unicolored. It has, at least two colors. The Musalman and Hindu, I do not know, I do not know. So Turk and Hindu are really these opposing dualities that one has to get beyond to arrive at true unity. But contrast these with lines from a qasida, and this is actually an example that I include in my book, that Saib wrote while celebrating the Safavid victory over the Mughals at Kandahar. So So here, blackness does have a kind of negative attribute. It's associated with the Indians, so he refers to them as the Hindians. So it's not the sort of traditional Hindu, but he's using it to show how the cowardly, liverless Indians, whose faces became yellowed, again, due to their cowardice and incompetence in battle, had this overcome even their blackness. So these examples illustrate how, when exploring concepts of race, caution is warranted in inferring social attitudes from literary motifs. Moreover, the various genres invoking climatic humoralism discussed above, whether on geography, medicine, physiognomy, or another subject, provide a counterpoint to this poetic image of India as the land of unmitigated blackness. So I'm going to conclude here. There is actually a section that I had on caste and terms for caste that maybe that I think I can reserve for the Q&A session. In conclusion, I'd like to return to Bernier and what we might learn from juxtaposing his views on race with the Mughal discourses of the time. Danishmand Khan might well have found Bernier's theory to be intelligible through the partial resemblance to the theory of climes. However, the shared background of Greek learning and biblical tradition absorbed into Islamic learning may have afforded Mughal intellectuals of the 17th century more commonality with European writers of a slightly earlier era. In some spheres, Mughal and European attitudes of anti-Blackness were similar, not in all. In other contexts, regarding the people of India, Mughal writers often repurposed the Greek and biblical inheritance to make accommodative gestures. But there is a far more crucial difference between Bernier's thoughts on human diversity and those of the Mughal intellectuals he would have met. The race in medieval and early modern Europe looked very different from its 19th century iterations. Recent scholarship argues that it serves to anticipate and scaffold these later developments. According to Walter Mignolo, I quote, "Race as racism is a particular configuration that emerged in and during the European Renaissance as an intrinsic part of the consolidation of capitalism in the Atlantic economy and of Western expansion from the 16th century," end quote. By contrast, the hierarchical discourses of difference in Mughal India never did lead to racial capitalism and colonialism. Mughal history rather was cut off at its knees, and none of these pre-modern discourses emerge as the basis for unified theories of race. Yet these discursive structures could still be easily repurposed and deployed in the colonial period for all sundry forms of classification and division, with race and by extension nation as the primary and unifying categories for fathering difference and hierarchy. So I'm going to end here, and I look forward to the discussion in just a minute. I'm going to stop the screen share.
So are you ready for some questions, Supriya?
Sure.
Okay, so thanks for that talk. That was really, I think, fascinating. I think there are so many threads that one can kind of think through. I just wanted to point to two observations that kind of struck me. I really loved the idea of Danishmand Khan and Bernier having a conversation and finding a certain kind of common ground around notions drawn from the Bible, and also a certain kind of Ptolemaic understanding of how geography affects, people. So I can just almost picture the two of them trying to speak to one another, and I thought that was really interesting. I also really thought your point about context was very important, thinking through Aine Akbari's comments about Bengal as a kind of miasma that creates a certain set of outcomes, rebelliousness and lassitude, other kinds of attributes. Whereas, 50 years later, when Bengal has been conquered, in the hands of an author like, I mean, in a book like Subeh Sadiq, it's a verdant, beautiful place, and all of that has kind of gone by the wayside. So it kind of drew my mind to similar representations of the Deccan as they unfold, from the 1500s, late 1500s onwards, into the campaigns of the late 1600s, and then of course Hafiz Khan's commentary about Bidya Nayak and being dark skinned, and all the Mughal courtiers laughing at him. But again, just the kinds of like, this is not a systematic system, and I think that in some ways what makes this story so fascinating is its diversity. The fact that you've got individual authors who are drawing on different kinds of intellectual lineages. But at the end of the day, this entire schematic is not necessarily being sponsored or pushed by a state. And I think that that's what's in some ways really different from what we are seeing in the Mughal context and what we will see in a colonial context, right? The colonial state is really interested in enumerating and figuring out who Indians are, what makes them tick, and it's done along these racial lines in the beginning of the 19th century. The Mughal state, by contrast, doesn't seem to have the same interest. Is that true? Are there contexts in which the Mughal state does think seriously along racial lines, perhaps in certain kinds of administrative contexts? Do you know of anything along those lines?
So thank you. So your comments sort of, before I get to that, just to comment on your earlier observation about diversity of context. It is true that these kind of celebration of land and geography do tend to happen in after times of conquest. So whether it's Bengal for Supriya Gandhi, whether it's Kashmir, some decades after the conquest and absorption of Kashmir, other places, the celebration of natural landscape, topography, and so on does happen a few decades after that. And so in a sense, it is part of this process of cultural absorption, though again, it's not done always with the heavy hand of a state, and it's again it's a very different relationship from compared to the colonial state. Now, in terms of classification and enumeration, I think one difficulty is we don't have access to everything. We don't have access to all the and there are others, Monis, you would know better than I do, just in terms of lists of castes, lists that were done for the sake of revenue collection, for instance. We don't have all the administrative records at all. We have these courtly texts, but we don't actually have the archives the way Ottoman archives exist, for instance. There are some in certain contexts. So there are many ways in which the inhabitants of India are classified and are described. The Aini Akbari is doing this. Sometimes this discourse would seem to be repeating certain familiar tropes and also recirculating much earlier texts. So then one must ask the question of, what work is this doing in a particular context? So Jahangir, he commissions translations of a range of Indic texts, and one of the things that he does is get this much older text by Shahristani, Kitab al-Milal wa Nahal, this book of different sectarian groups that has a lot of wrong information about India, actually. But it includes Indians, and it has this fairly ecumenical outlook. And this actually is an alternative to dividing people by clime or dividing people in a hierarchical order. See, he gets that translated into Persian, a simpler Persian for the use of his court. So there is a lot of knowledge produced, but it's not like the kinds of colonial knowledge and enumeration. One does have this transitional period where there are works that reference the earlier Mughal works, but there is still, there are new practices of enumeration and organization. I'm thinking of Qatil's Haftamasha, or I'm thinking of the Tashrihul Aqwam by James Skinner, which I don't know if you've seen, but it's the most sort of stunning list of using the category Qawm to refer to to Jati, and he had it lavishly illustrated. Also, he wrote it in Persian. That's the most detailed list I've seen in Persian. You don't have things like that that are available from the Mughal era.
Yeah. No, I was just thinking of these really interesting sets of documents, Arzochera documents, which are, presentment documents.
Yes. Yes.
And they list people's race, and they not only, will focus on how people look, whether they have moles and other kinds of distinguishing markers, but also there's a real kind of interest in what this person's origins might be. And it would be really interesting to, look at those kinds of documents, that, those kinds of archives, placing them alongside perhaps, Mughal administrative ruminations about taxes and tax collection and castes and other kinds of communities, and how, a certain administrative discourse gets kind of mapped onto or is dependent on other kinds of pre-existing discourses. And that relationship would be very interesting for someone like myself, who's, thinks about the Mughal state a great deal.
Absolutely. I mean, my thought sort of went to that, muster rolls and so on. There's a whole lot, of course, that can be accessed, like if there wasn't a pandemic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Of course, this is a fascinating project. And we have so many questions, Supriya, for you. So I'm going to start trying to curate them as best as I can. So, there's a bunch of questions being asked by people about, all discourses that are emerging, racial discourses that are emerging from within India itself. We might call them Indic, so non-Persianate, discourses that are not dependent on a certain kind of biblical lineage or, Ptolemaic understandings of geography. And would you be able to say something about how, ideas drawing from perhaps certain kinds of Sanskritic texts or certain kinds of Vedic understandings of race would be mapped onto the materials that you're talking about, and how, and whether the authors would actually have access to that, and whether they would be able to deploy them in any way, or would they just ignore them?
So, I don't know that I have an answer to that. I've been discussing it with other people who sort of work on such materials. Audrey Trushki, shared with me sort of one Maratha text that describes the Mughals as red in color and so on. Without more work, again, so I'm not sure, how to sort of develop a typology of this and compare the two and look at their linkages.
Okay. So there's a question by Anurag Khond, who asks whether we can think about language as a way to understand racial qualities in the Mughal cultural realm. He goes on to suggest that there was a common notion of Arabic being the language of religion, Persian being linked to the language of culture, and Turkish being the language of war. And hence Babur, supposedly speaks about conversing in Chagatai because it's a manly language versus, say, Persian. How does language map onto these, your understandings of the subject?
That's a sort of great question, and my lens was really that of Persian, because that is really that is the dominant language of the intellectuals through whom Bernier interacted. Again, just to limit this, I used Bernier as my entry point in terms of what entry point into discourses that people around him would have been familiar with. I'm not viewing this as any kind of sort of major encounter. It's not a transformative encounter on both sides. It's a kind of sort of mere, very light brushing against each other kind of encounter. But I think by this time, Arabic and Chagatai really had certain separate spheres in terms of the kinds of knowledge produced. It would be. And the question is also, it's an interesting question that I would like to look into. But when one is thinking of multilingualism, it's often like Persian and Braj, for instance, or and Arabic. I don't know how much Chagatai is playing into this in the period that I'm talking about.
Yeah. So Anand Yang has a question for you. He'd like you to elaborate on the terms used in Farsi, Hindustani, and other South Asian languages. How are you glossing race? He goes on to add that race is also loosely used in English and other European languages before the 19th century, just as class and caste were. So
So I'd like to
perhaps
clarify, I am not glossing these as race. I hope that I'm making that clear.
okay, so what would the terms perhaps be that, would be used in a text? Would it just be national? Would it be ethnic? To describe, is there no category of race, say in Persian, a term, a phrase, a turn of phrase?
Um, you know,
Qawm, Vatan.
yes. So there are terms for social groups. There are terms for social groups. There is Qawm, that it's the most common term. It's the one that has endured the most. It's the one that has been kind of recontextualized and reimagined in the 19th century, when one talks of the Hindu qawms and the Muslim qawms, and these are there's a racial quality to this. You can see that in sort of the example I gave from Mehdi Ali Khan. There's a linked with blood, linked with nation, linked with the idea of these sort of civilizational differences. So qawm in this sense, in this 19th century sense, is not linked to geography. It's something, it's not something that is malleable and shaped by the particular land of India. But and for me, it's still an open question. I have been looking into different instances of the usage of these terms, and I haven't found any consistent thing that in the 17th century that might say be the seeds for this later use of qawm. So, one test case is that of caste. The most common word, ubiquitous word that is used to talk of the four varnas, is qawm. That Hindus have these four qawms. That just becomes like a standard thing. And then later on, the four qawms of the Musalmans, the Sayyid, Sheikh, Pathan, etc., also become like the corollary to that. Now, when Bernier talks about these qawms, he actually uses the term tribe. And a tribe in that understanding. And, so I am absolutely, I totally agree that race is used very loosely. Bernier was not tapping into any consistent discourse of race at this point. Nothing. It's nothing like the racism of Gorbunov, in the 19th century. That these discourses were inconsistent. But by the time of Bernier, I think the common ground, there was just a little bit more of a gulf between Bernier and the other Mughal discourses. But when it does come, so going back to the idea of qawm and tribe, in some senses, qawm functions a little bit like tribe, because tribe is seen as different units of a whole. But then but qawm is also used to describe a whole. It's a very malleable use of the term. And then qawm is not separated necessarily from other groups that are based on belief. So, I was like combing through the Dabistan, for instance, or even, this work, the Shahristani's work that was used in the Mughal court, to see, are they using firqa when they're classifying people by belief? Are they using qawm when they're just referring to people on the basis of some kind of common narrative, or, any other kind of basis? And they don't seem to be doing that. Firqa is also used interchangeably. Qawm might be most ubiquitous, but it is also being used, and taifa as well.
Right. Yeah, jins. Anyway, that's great. Audrey Trushka had a question about mutability in your sources. So if someone moves to a new area, they move from Kashmir to Bengal, is race seen as mutable in the materials that you're looking at?
So that's a great question, and in fact, it is a sort of logical question that comes up, and I do believe this is discussed in earlier Arabic literature on blackness. Whether is it really solely affected by the climes or not? And I have a feeling that it's not discussed explicitly per se. Or at least I haven't found that. But one sees that through the changing rhetoric that one has. So Abul Fazl's move of just using the gandom gun instead of surh, the wheat-colored complexion instead of the white and surh, which is seen as the most desirable. So I think there are subtle ways in which that is acknowledged, that bodies change, and maybe there isn't necessarily a distinct Turani body that is unchanged in India. Now these discourses compete with other contradictory discourses also. So it's not as though there's one that is blanketing the other.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about the interest in certain kinds of marriages, right? The idea that if you marry Kashmiri women, for example, that they bring a certain kind of beauty into the family, and that beauty, I assume, is linked to a certain kind of fairness. So there is
one of the main source for that really is Bernier. So he talks about the Mughals wanting to marry Kashmiri women so that their children would be fair. And I think, so you don't necessarily see this this explicitly discussed in other texts. And then, of course, one wonders to what extent Bernier is imposing his own idea of whiteness on this. Not to say that that it didn't exist also.
Yeah. So Razan Idris has a question for you, Supriya, and it has to do with ilme firasat or physiognomy. Mm-hmm. And he's just wondering how, the interest in, being able to read faces and, physiognomical sciences would have played out in the text that you're looking at. So someone like Akbar, for example, supposedly had a perfect ability to read people's faces and tell attributes and characteristics just by, looking at them. Shah Jahan too. And I was just wondering if you can somehow bring that skill set into a conversation about the people that you as an emperor might be looking at. And if, there's any way to talk about race again, or essential characteristics, using this idea of physiognomy as a very crucial science for rule and other things.
Yeah, so that little text on physiognomy that I showed an extract from was actually gifted by Akbar to Jahangir and kind of passed down, seemingly passed down as a sort of treasured handbook in the Mughal royal family. Now, so definitely there, the point of firasat is to have this discernment. And that is one of the characteristics of an emperor. And no doubt there are different ways of acquiring it and passing it down. And it also doesn't mean that Akbar or Jahangir were kind of like seeing what this treatise says on physiognomy and kind of mindlessly sort of just applying that. Akbar was supposed to have had physiognomically like the best face, and it had sort of a large mole. His skin was sort of wheat colored and so on. So it didn't correspond exactly to what this author said. At the same time, I think it gives you an insight into this. Now, one person who has been interested in the link between physiognomy and Mughal art is Yael Rice. I know that she worked on that. I don't know of her latest work on this, but there are ways in which the science of physiognomy might help us unpack or understand different cultural products.
So a whole bunch of questions about blackness. I'm thinking about Srita K over here, Anurag Advani, and others. And let me just read the question. There is a tendency in older Mughal scholarship to see Habshis as merely slaves, but the case of Malik Ambar and other Ethiopian-born soldiers suggests that they played much more diverse roles that reflect their social and political mobility in early modern South Asia. How do we think about Mughal theories of race and anti-Blackness as compatible with this historical reality? And I think, we, of course, just to add to that, we encounter Siddhis not just as opponents of the Mughals, but also as kotwals and, police officers in Delhi in the 18th century, but all over the place. I mean, so Siddhis really make their way into Mughal accounts. And so just to kind of add to the question.
Yeah. So, one very rich site, of course, for this is the Deccan, where one sees these different encounters and perhaps more explicit encounters of Blackness, partly because, again, this is a project that I've sort of been delving into more during the pandemic. I haven't reached out as much to get a richer picture from that end. And another thing is, I do know that there are scholars working on the Deccan, for instance, who are offering revised opinions of even terms and concepts that were used. I know that Roy Fischel, for instance, has a revised view of the term that was supposedly Gharbi, or Westerner, that was supposedly used to refer to Iranians in the Deccan. And have you come across that, Monis? That it's actually the Gharib, or strangers, and not sort of Westerners. So I mean, there's a lot, of course, there's a lot more that needs to be done by delving into the sources.
Okay. So another set of questions having to do with, and I'm just looking over here, thinking through the texts and the politics of the text. So, situating the authors in larger contexts outside of intellectual traditions. Someone's very curious, this is Mrinalini, who's very curious about whether you have compared your analyses of race and climes with similar analyses coming from the British in India. And specifically, she refers to a text over here, Jonathan Gill Harris's The First Firangis. So two questions, really. One about situating texts in their larger political context, and then just a comparison to a book by Jonathan Gill Harris.
So for the first, for reasons of time, my focus was on the text and not the detailed sort of politics of their authors. One also doesn't want to impose a reductive reading on them. In the case of Abul Fazl, I think it is quite clear what he's doing, and a lot of people have written on that. So when Abul Fazl is downplaying the curse of Ham, or making these sort of accommodative gestures, that is really in line with his whole political project. Now, the question is, one doesn't know necessarily about the political context of all these other figures. For Muhammad Sadiq Isfahani, yes, there's a little bit that one can piece from his own writings, Harawi, the author of Malumat al-Afaq. So I think, sometimes. These authors are anonymous also. So there's definitely much more to be done when it comes to doing that. And comparing with similar analyses of the British in India, the first Firangis, yeah, so So I'm not sort of quite sure what exactly you're referring to. Mrinalini is referring to with Gil Harris's First Firangis. I did look at the book when it came out, which was a few years ago. But in terms of the sort of maybe transformation of bodies with regard to the climate, I think that there definitely are some continuities.
Hmm. Hunter Bandy has a question for you. He's referring to Mana Kia's new book published by Stanford, Persian Age Selves. And he, indicates that she seems to have moved away from a blood-centric analysis of genealogy and instead favors discussing genealogy practices of Persianate adab. Does Supriya observe adab-centric genealogies influencing views on Qom, ethnic, racial descent? And if so, how?
Yeah, thank you. So, so I think Mana Kia's book is really an important intervention in this whole question. And, the focus might be on a slightly later time period, though I think she does also look at a few earlier texts and genealogy. So I think that's a really crucial point that something like Qom doesn't have a relationship with blood at all in the way that these 19th century figures are portraying it. So blood is not necessarily the thing that transports these ideas of race or that makes a religious group racialized. There are, of course, there is the question of other attributes, that might be fixed on certain categories of people.
Right. Another question from Matthew Melvin Koshki, following up on Audrey Trushka's question. Basically, in the physiognomical literature, there are wide variations in physical descriptions and even skin color seemingly without regard to race, whereby a white person can always present as black, with character being the most important category or attribute. Do you see continuity and or rupture in the rise of sharp colonialist distinctions between physical bodies?
Yeah, so absolutely. So the issue with physiognomy is that, yes, it is also related to humors, it's related to the climes, but physiognomy is not necessarily fixed. Physiognomy changes. And, as Matt has mentioned, due to character or so on, or, any other condition that can affect this change. So there's a correspondence with the climes and with humors, but it doesn't map out onto that exactly. At the same point, there are scholars of early modern Europe, would find a text on physiognomy written in the mid 16th century and say, yeah, well, this doesn't look like 19th century racism, but what are the implications of attributing moral qualities to physical features? Maybe that that provides the scaffolding for later theories of race. And in the Mughal case, of course, we don't have that whole later thing happening at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So just a couple of last questions for you, Supriya. Easy ones. If you had to suggest some readings on the question of race, what would you suggest?
Oh my goodness! So I'm a total novice to this, and I'm and one reason, so this was offered to me. I was invited to work on this, and it had been something that I was interested in thinking about in the Indian context, of course, because these days in adjacent fields, one has all these sophisticated discussions and conversations on race. And there isn't a whole lot when it comes to the Indian context. I mean, there was that book edited by Peter Robb. It doesn't, we have nowhere near the extent of scholarship on the Indian context. So frankly, I've just looked at a whole range of work, looking at ideas of proto-race in classical texts, early modern race, and so on. But I'm dipping into this. I'm by no means an expert in this at all.
No, and I must say, I really appreciate the fact that you are just kind of throwing yourself out there. Cautious types like me would tend to be extremely fearful if I may even use that to describe myself, to just say like, oh my God, I'm not going to actually say anything about this till 20 years from now when I feel like I really got it together. So I think, just kind of starting this conversation on a topic that most of us know so little about is precisely how you generate new scholarship in the field. And, I thank you. I really do. It's, really interesting to hear you just kind of think through the materials in the way that you are, and especially, your kind of interest in Persian sources and Persian materials and getting them to speak to one another. There's a lot over there, but I know you wanted to say something.
No, I had nothing in particular. No, I just sort of also appreciate the really thoughtful and insightful questions. And I wanted to thank the audience for bearing with me as I jump into this new territory and engaging.
Thank you so much, Supriya. We will just have a few last words to thank our sponsors of this event. They include the Berkeley Urdu Initiative, they include the Berkeley Pakistan Initiative, they include the Initiative on Political Conflict, Gender and People's Rights, the International and Area Studies Unit, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and also the Department of Near Eastern Studies. These were the sponsors of your talk. And I wish you all the luck with this project, but more specifically with the project that you're really working on right now, trying to get out. Really looking forward to seeing that soon. And I, of course, thank you again for your time and just, your willingness to talk to us. It's always great to, see new areas of knowledge get opened up. And thank you again. So I will see you soon.
Thank you, Manus.